The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine has sent shockwaves across the globe, with ramifications that stretch far beyond the borders of these two nations. What initially appeared to be a regional conflict has evolved into a proxy war between the East and West, encapsulating broader geopolitical, economic, and ideological battles. This war, which some argue is necessary for dismantling Western dominance, has also paved the way for the emergence of BRICS as a formidable alternative global power structure. The ripple effects have reverberated in not just military terms, but in global economics, diplomacy, and alliances. This piece will explore in detail how the Ukraine war became a turning point in the East-West power dynamic, why the war is seen as a critical moment for the West's decline, and how BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is emerging stronger and expanding its influence globally, even attracting countries like Turkey, Hungary, and parts of Eastern Europe. The Ukraine War, a prelude to global realignment. When Russia launched its military invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the world watched with bated breath. Many Western powers, especially the United States and NATO, viewed it as an aggressive move that violated Ukraine's sovereignty. Sanctions were imposed on Russia with the intent to cripple its economy and force it into submission. However, rather than being a straightforward clash between Russia and Ukraine, this conflict has grown into a much larger confrontation between the West, spearheaded by NATO, and a new Eastern Bloc led by Russia and supported by China and other BRICS nations. The war has shifted from being a local skirmish to a theater for a more profound global realignment. As Western nations attempted to isolate Russia economically, diplomatically, and politically, it backfired by catalyzing the rise of an alternative, multipolar world led by BRICS. This transformation poses significant consequences for the future of global governance, trade, and geopolitical alliances. Why the war was necessary to challenge the West. Western imperialism and economic dominance. For decades, Western nations, particularly the United States and its European allies, have dominated global affairs economically and politically through structures like NATO, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. They have dictated terms in international trade, global governance, and military interventions, often sidelining the interests of developing nations and emerging economies. From the BRICS perspective, the Ukraine war offers a unique opportunity to break the long-standing hegemony of the West. The war exposes the vulnerabilities of Western power, particularly its economic fragility and political fragmentation. The sanctions imposed on Russia, instead of debilitating its economy, have accelerated Russia's pivot to the east, encouraging stronger ties with China, India, and other non-Western nations. Additionally, the Ukraine war has highlighted the limits of NATO and the EU's military and political influence as they struggle to contain the fallout without directly engaging in the conflict. The war also underscores a growing frustration among non-Western nations regarding Western double standards. The West's humanitarian rhetoric is often contradicted by its own military interventions in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, where regime change and economic exploitation have led to instability and suffering. From this vantage point, the Ukraine war is seen as a justifiable pushback against Western imperialism and a necessary step towards a more equitable global order. Economic decoupling and the rise of a new economic bloc. Western sanctions aimed at crippling Russia's economy have had unintended consequences. Rather than isolating Russia, they have prompted a global economic decoupling between the West and the East. Russia has shifted its energy exports toward China and India, which have gladly purchased oil at discounted rates, allowing these economies to grow. More importantly, these sanctions accelerated the movement towards de-dollarization, with BRICS countries, particularly China and Russia, increasingly trading in their own currencies instead of relying on the US dollar as the global reserve currency. This decoupling is seen by many as a necessary step to undermine the West's economic dominance, particularly that of the United States. The dollar has long been a weapon of economic coercion through sanctions and trade imbalances. By creating parallel financial structures, such as alternative payment systems to SWIFT, the global banking transaction system, BRICS nations are actively challenging the West's stranglehold on global finance. In this context, the war has emerged as a trigger that hastens the demise of Western economic dominance. The ripple effects of these financial realignments are far-reaching, with other non-Western nations, such as Turkey and Hungary, showing interest in joining the BRICS fold. BRICS expansion, the rise of the East. The most significant development to emerge from the Ukraine war is the solidification and expansion of BRICS. While BRICS started as an economic group, it has increasingly taken on a political and strategic dimension in the wake of the Ukraine conflict. Each member of BRICS has had to navigate the complex political terrain created by the war, and it has forced them to align more closely in opposition to Western policies, particularly on sanctions and trade. BRICS as a counterbalance to the West. BRICS represents 40% of the world's population and nearly a quarter of the global economy. The grouping offers an alternative model of development and governance. West. It promotes multilateralism, respect for sovereignty, and the democratization of international institutions. As the West falters in its efforts to contain Russia, BRICS has stepped up to present itself as the future of global governance, emphasizing cooperation, development, and mutual respect over interventionism and economic coercion. BRICS members like China and India have benefited from their neutral or supportive stance on the Ukraine war. China has deepened its trade ties with Russia, while India has significantly increased its energy imports from Russia. Far from being isolated, Russia is actively integrating with the global South, forming a new economic and political bloc that poses a direct challenge to Western dominance. This war has provided BRICS nations with a platform to question the legitimacy of the West's global leadership, particularly in light of the economic crises that have gripped Europe. European nations like Germany, Italy, and France are grappling with skyrocketing energy prices and inflation as a direct result of the war and the sanctions regime. This internal turmoil further weakens the European Union and NATO, making them less attractive as allies. BRICS expansion, Turkey, Hungary, and beyond. One of the most notable developments in recent months has been the interest shown by non-traditional allies of the East in joining or aligning with BRICS. Turkey and Hungary, for example, have expressed interest in closer relations with BRICS. Turkey, a NATO member, has increasingly found itself at odds with the West, particularly over its handling of the Kurdish issue and its relationship with Russia. Hungary, under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, has also taken a more nationalist and anti-EU stance, aligning itself more closely with Eastern powers like Russia and China. The potential inclusion of these nations in BRICS would significantly alter the geopolitical landscape, as it would symbolize a shift of allegiance from Western-led structures to Eastern ones. This would mark a historical realignment in global alliances, particularly within Europe, where countries like Hungary and Serbia are openly defying the EU's stance on the Ukraine conflict and seeking deeper ties with Russia and China. Eastern European nations, which have traditionally been part of the Western sphere of influence, are also showing signs of shifting allegiances. Economic turmoil, political instability, and disillusionment with the EU's handling of the war have prompted some countries to reconsider their alliances. Nations like Serbia have long had close ties with Russia, and the Ukraine war has only deepened these relationships. Furthermore, countries like Poland and Hungary have have become increasingly critical of the EU's policies, especially its liberal social policies and economic mismanagement. In Hungary's case, Viktor Orbán has adopted a pro-Russian stance, which is in direct contrast to the rest of the EU. This growing dissent within Europe, coupled with the allure of BRICS and the economic opportunities it offers, signals a potential fragmentation of the European Union. As more nations in Eastern Europe align themselves with Russia and BRICS, the dream of a united Europe may soon unravel, further diminishing the influence of the West. The West's decline, political and economic instability. While the Ukraine war has strengthened the East, it has simultaneously exposed deep divisions and weaknesses within the West. Political instability, economic stagnation, and social unrest have plagued several Western nations since the outbreak of the war. UK, a nation in decline. The United Kingdom has been one of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine, supplying weapons and imposing sanctions on Russia. However, the consequences of these actions have been dire for the British economy. The UK has faced economic recession, inflation, and a cost of living crisis that has left many questioning the country's future. Political instability has also plagued the UK, with multiple changes in leadership in a short span of time. The UK's exit from the European Union, Brexit, further compounded its isolation, making it less able to cope with the economic shocks of the Ukraine war. Germany and Italy, economic woes. Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe, has been severely impacted by the war. Its reliance on Russian energy has left it vulnerable, and the sanctions regime has caused energy prices to skyrocket. The German economy, which was once the bedrock of the European Union, is now teetering on the edge of recession. Italy faces similar challenges, with political instability adding to its economic woes. Both nations are struggling to maintain stability in the face of rising inflation and public dissatisfaction with the handling of the war. France, social unrest and political turmoil. In France, the Ukraine war has exacerbated existing challenges related to political turmoil and social unrest. The country has witnessed multiple protests, strikes and riots over the rising cost of living, energy prices, and controversial government policies. France's involvement in the Ukraine conflict, coupled with its economic challenges, has only fueled public dissatisfaction. President Emmanuel Macron's government has struggled to maintain control amid increasing pressure from both left-wing and right-wing populist movements. The instability in France is indicative of a broader trend across Europe, where governments are finding it increasingly difficult to balance their commitments to supporting Ukraine with their domestic economic and social challenges. The situation in France is further complicated by its historical role as one of the key pillars of the European Union. If France continues to experience political and social instability, it could have significant repercussions for the entire region. Weaken the EU's ability to project unity and strength on the global stage. This, in turn, could accelerate the decline of Western influence, particularly in Europe, where internal divisions are becoming more pronounced. The shrinking West, a fragmented and doomed population. One of the most striking consequences of the Ukraine war has been the growing realization that the West, once considered the pinnacle of global stability and prosperity, is now shrinking in both influence and cohesion. The conflict has exposed deep-seated weaknesses in Western societies, from political fragmentation to economic decline. Decline of Western leadership. For decades, the West, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union, has dominated global institutions, trade, and diplomacy. However, the Ukraine war has revealed that this dominance is no longer as secure as it once was. The inability of Western nations to decisively end the conflict or contain Russia has eroded their credibility on the global stage. Moreover, the economic sanctions imposed on Russia have backfired, creating significant economic challenges for Western nations themselves, including inflation, energy crises, and supply chain disruptions. As Western leadership falters, many countries, particularly in the global south, are turning towards alternative power structures, such as BRICS, for leadership and cooperation. The failure of the West to address the needs and aspirations of these nations has led to a growing disillusionment with Western-led global governance models. Internal divisions and populist movements. Another factor contributing to the West's decline is the rise of internal divisions, particularly in Europe and the United States. In many Western countries, populist movements, both on the left and right, are gaining traction as a response to the failures of traditional political elites. These movements are often fueled by a sense of economic insecurity, cultural alienation, and frustration with globalization. For example, in the United States, the political divide between Democrats and Republicans has deepened, with each side accusing the other of undermining the country's future. Populist leaders like Donald Trump have capitalized on this division, advocating for isolationist and nationalist policies that challenge the traditional globalist agenda of the US political establishment. Similarly, in Europe, populist parties have gained ground by opposing EU policies on immigration, economic austerity, and global trade. This rise of populism is further weakening the ability of Western nations to present a united front in addressing global challenges like the Ukraine war. The result is a fragmented and increasingly polarized political landscape, where national interests often take precedence over collective action. Social unrest and economic instability. In addition to political fragmentation, the West is grappling with significant social unrest and economic instability. The Ukraine war has exacerbated pre-existing economic challenges, such as income inequality, stagnating wages, and rising living costs. In countries like the UK, France, and Germany, protests over energy prices, inflation, and government austerity measures have become increasingly common. The economic strain caused by the war, particularly in terms of energy shortages and rising fuel prices, has hit working-class populations the hardest. Many in these countries feel that their governments are prioritizing foreign policy objectives, such as supporting Ukraine, over addressing domestic concerns like housing, healthcare, and job security. This perception has contributed to growing discontent and distrust of political elites, leading to a sense of alienation among large segments of the population. The social fabric of Western nations is also under strain, with debates over identity, culture, and immigration further dividing societies. In many cases, these divisions have led to the rise of nationalist and xenophobic sentiments, challenging the multicultural and liberal values that have traditionally been championed by Western democracies. BRICS as a beacon for a new global order. As the West grapples with these internal and external challenges, BRICS has emerged as a beacon for a new global order. The grouping, which started as an economic forum for developing nations, has evolved into a powerful geopolitical alliance that challenges the dominance of Western-led institutions. One of the key reasons BRICS has gained traction is its emphasis on multilateralism, sovereignty, and respect for national interests. Unlike the West, which has often imposed its values and policies on other nations through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, BRICS promotes a more inclusive and decentralized approach to global governance. This vision resonates with many countries that have grown weary of the West's interventionist policies. BRICS offers an alternative model that prioritizes cooperation, trade, and development over military intervention and economic coercion. The bloc's strategic vision is also centered around creating a more balanced global economic system, where the dominance of the US dollar and Western financial institutions is diminished in favor of a more equitable system that reflects the interests of the global South. One of the most tangible ways in which BRICS is challenging Western dominance is through economic cooperation and infrastructure development. China, in particular, has played a leading role in financing infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America through its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. These projects have provided much-needed investment in areas like transportation, energy, and telecommunications, helping to spur economic growth in developing nations. By offering an alternative source of funding to Western-dominated institutions like the IMF, BRICS has empowered countries to pursue their own development agendas without the strings attached to Western aid. This has further strengthened the bloc's appeal, as many countries seek to escape the debt traps and austerity measures imposed by Western financial institutions. Another critical aspect of BRICS' strategy is its push for de-dollarization and financial independence from the West. The dominance of the US dollar in global trade has long been a source of frustration for many non-Western nations, as it gives the US significant leverage over global financial markets. The use of the dollar as the world's reserve currency allows the US to impose sanctions and control international transactions through mechanisms like SWIFT. In response, BRICS has been actively working to create alternative financial systems that reduce dependence on the dollar. This includes initiatives to settle trade between BRICS countries in local currencies, bypassing the need for dollar-denominated transactions. Additionally, Russia and China have been at the forefront of creating alternatives to SWIFT, allowing them to trade with each other and other nations without relying on Western-controlled financial systems. The de-dollarization efforts by BRICS are not just symbolic. They represent a concerted effort to weaken the West's economic stranglehold on global trade. As more countries join BRICS or align themselves with the bloc's goals, the influence of the US dollar and Western financial institutions will likely continue to erode. Global support for BRICS beyond the East. While BRICS is often associated with emerging markets and developing nations, its appeal extends beyond the traditional East. In recent years, countries in regions like Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of the Western Hemisphere have shown interest in aligning with BRICS or adopting its model of development and cooperation. Eastern Europe's shift towards BRICS, as mentioned earlier, includes nations like Hungary and Serbia taking steps towards closer ties with Russia and BRICS. This shift is driven by a combination of economic pragmatism and political disillusionment with the European Union. Countries in Eastern Europe, which have historically been dependent on Russian energy, have found themselves caught in the crossfire of Western sanctions and geopolitical tensions. As the EU struggles to provide viable alternatives, these nations are increasingly looking eastward for solutions. Hungary, under the leadership of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, has openly criticized EU policies and pursued closer ties with both Russia and China. Orbán's nationalist government has positioned Hungary as a bridge between East and West, leveraging its geopolitical position to secure energy deals and investment from BRICS countries. Turkey, a NATO member, has also been exploring closer ties with BRICS, particularly with Russia and China. While Turkey's relationship with the West has been fraught with tension in recent years, particularly over issues like Kurdish separatism and human rights, its ties with Russia have strengthened. Turkey's purchase of Russian S-400 missile systems, despite opposition from NATO, is a testament to its growing strategic independence from the West. In the context of the Ukraine war, Turkey has positioned itself as a mediator, maintaining diplomatic relations with both Russia and Ukraine. However, its economic ties with BRICS countries, particularly China, have grown in recent years, signaling a broader shift towards the East. Turkey's strategic realignment reflects a broader trend of nations seeking to balance their relationships between East and West, with BRICS offering an attractive alternative to Western-led institutions. The support for BRICS is not limited to Eastern Europe or the Middle East. It extends to much of the global South. where countries are increasingly disillusioned with Western-led development models. In Africa, Latin America, and Asia, BRICS is seen as a more reliable and equitable partner for development. In Africa, for example, China has become the continent's largest trading partner, investing heavily in infrastructure and development projects. Similarly, Brazil, under the leadership of Lula da Silva, has positioned itself as a key player in the BRICS alliance, advocating for greater South-South cooperation and challenging Western dominance in international organizations. Lula's return to power in Brazil has reinvigorated the country's role in BRICS, with Brazil now actively promoting multilateralism, economic development, and environmental sustainability through BRICS frameworks. Nations like Argentina and Venezuela, which have faced severe economic challenges and sanctions from the West, are increasingly looking towards BRICS for support. Argentina, in particular, has expressed interest in joining BRICS, signaling its desire to pivot away from Western financial dependence and embrace a more diverse set of global partnerships. Asia, home to BRICS heavyweights China and India, is also witnessing a shift in global alignment. Southeast Asian nations, traditionally under the influence of Western economic policies, are increasingly engaging with China and India through trade, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic initiatives. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines are keen to explore greater cooperation with BRICS, especially as they seek alternatives to Western-dominated economic models. Global public sentiment, support for BRICS from the West. Interestingly, public sentiment in some Western countries is also shifting in favor of BRICS, or at least showing sympathy for the bloc's principles. As people in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand grow increasingly disillusioned with their own governments and political elites, they are beginning to question the unipolar world order dominated by Western powers. Growing discontent in the United States and Canada. In the United States and Canada, dissatisfaction with government policies, economic inequality, and the perception of endless foreign interventions have contributed to a shift in public opinion. Many citizens are critical of the vast sums of money spent on military ventures abroad, including the support for Ukraine, while pressing domestic issues like healthcare, infrastructure, and education remain underfunded. A significant segment of the population is questioning the wisdom of confronting Russia and China, instead advocating for a more restrained and pragmatic foreign policy that focuses on domestic well-being. Moreover, the failure of the US government to effectively address internal crises, such as the opioid epidemic, racial tensions, and economic disparities, has led some Americans to view BRICS countries, particularly China, as having better handled their domestic issues. The rapid economic growth and infrastructure development in BRICS nations stand in stark contrast to the stagnation and decay seen in parts of the US and Canada. Australia and New Zealand. Ties to China and trade. In Australia and New Zealand, public opinion is also evolving, particularly regarding China's role in the global economy. Both countries are heavily reliant on trade with China, and many Australians and New Zealanders are aware of the economic consequences of taking a hardline stance against Beijing. While their governments maintain strong ties with the US, public discourse increasingly acknowledges the necessity of balancing relations between the West and BRICS nations, particularly China, to safeguard economic interests. This pragmatism is reflected in the fact that while political elites may espouse anti-China rhetoric, business leaders and parts of the general population in both countries understand the importance of maintaining robust economic ties with the East. The allure of BRICS lies in its offer of economic partnerships without the political and military entanglements that often accompany Western alliances. Fractured Western Europe. The last holdout. Despite the growing global support for BRICS, Much of Western Europe remains staunchly aligned with traditional Western power structures. However, even within Western Europe, there are signs of fracture. Countries like the UK, Germany, Italy, and France are witnessing political and economic instability, which is eroding public trust in the ability of their governments to manage both domestic and international challenges. In the UK, post-Brexit economic woes, political leadership crises, and widespread protests have revealed deep discontent among the population. While the British government remains aligned with the US and NATO, public opinion is increasingly skeptical of the long-term benefits of these alliances, particularly as the country faces rising inflation and stagnating wages. Germany, once the engine of European economic growth, is struggling with the economic fallout of the Ukraine war, particularly its dependence on Russian energy. Sanctions and energy shortages have led to rising costs of living, industrial slowdowns, and public protests. While Germany's political leadership continues to support NATO and the EU's stance on the Ukraine war, sections of the German population, particularly in the eastern part of the country, are more sympathetic to Russia's position and wary of the economic toll that continued confrontation with Moscow will entail. In Italy and France, political instability, high unemployment, and social unrest are causing cracks in the facade of Western unity. Both countries have witnessed mass protests and growing support for populist, nationalist movements that challenge EU policies and advocate for more independent foreign policies. While these countries are not yet openly considering alignment with BRICS, the rise of Eurosceptic and anti-globalist sentiments suggests that their future political direction is far from certain. The future of the West. Shrinking influence and internal strife. As the BRICS bloc continues to expand and assert its influence globally, the West, particularly Europe, faces a period of internal strife and diminishing global relevance. The Ukraine war has accelerated the West's decline by exposing its economic vulnerabilities, political divisions, and social instability. Economic challenges. Inflation and energy crises. One of the most immediate consequences of the Ukraine war for the West has been the energy crisis, particularly in Europe. With Russia cutting off gas supplies to Europe in retaliation for sanctions, countries like Germany, Italy, and the UK are facing energy shortages and skyrocketing prices. This has led to widespread protests and growing disillusionment with the EU's handling of the crisis. Inflation is also a major concern, with the cost of living rising sharply across Europe and North America. The economic hardships caused by inflation, combined with stagnant wages and rising inequality, have fueled social unrest and political instability. Governments in Western nations are struggling to maintain public support, as citizens increasingly question the wisdom of prioritizing foreign policy objectives over domestic needs. Political instability is another significant challenge for the West. In the UK, the fallout from Brexit and the Ukraine war has left the country in a state of perpetual political crisis, with multiple changes in leadership and no clear path forward. In France, the Yellow Vest protests and ongoing social unrest are a reflection of deep-rooted dissatisfaction with the government's economic policies and the growing divide between the political elite and the general population. Even in the United States, the polarization of the political landscape has led to gridlock in Congress, preventing meaningful action on key issues like healthcare, infrastructure, and climate change. The rise of populist movements on both the left and right has further eroded trust in government institutions, making it difficult to forge a unified national policy on foreign and domestic issues. This political instability is compounded by social fragmentation, as Western societies become increasingly divided along lines of class, race, and ideology. The growing wealth gap, coupled with cultural and political polarization, has created a sense of alienation and disillusionment among large segments of the population. This fragmentation weakens the West's ability to project power and influence on the global stage as internal divisions take precedence over collective action. Diminishing global influence. As the West becomes more inwardly focused on managing its internal crises, its global influence continues to shrink. The inability to decisively resolve the Ukraine war, coupled with the economic and political instability it has caused, has eroded the West's standing in the international community. Nations in the global South, as well as emerging powers like Turkey, Hungary, and even traditional Western allies, are increasingly turning to BRICS for leadership and economic partnership. The West's diminished influence is also reflected in the weakening of its traditional institutions, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF. These institutions, which were once the bedrock of Western-led global governance, are increasingly seen as out of touch with the needs of the developing world. In contrast, BRICS offers a more inclusive and responsive model of international cooperation, one that reflects the changing realities of the 21st century. Conclusion. The Ukraine war as a catalyst for a new global order. The Ukraine war has proven to be a pivotal moment in the evolution of the global power structure. While the conflict has caused immense suffering and instability, it has also catalyzed the rise of BRICS as a formidable global force, challenging the long-standing dominance of the West. The war has exposed the economic fragility, political instability, and social divisions within Western nations, leading to a shrinking influence on the global stage. At the same time, BRICS has capitalized on these weaknesses, expanding its economic and political reach by offering an alternative model of global governance that prioritizes sovereignty, development, and cooperation. The bloc's growing appeal to countries in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America underscores its potential to reshape the global order in the coming decades. As the West grapples with its internal challenges, the future of global leadership appears increasingly multipolar, with BRICS at the forefront of this new order. The Ukraine war may have been the spark that ignited this transformation, but it is the broader trends of economic decoupling, de-dollarization, and the rise of the global South that will ultimately define the 21st century world order. In this shifting landscape, the West's ability to adapt and reform will determine whether it can remain a relevant player on the global stage or whether it will continue to shrink in influence, overtaken by a more dynamic and diverse coalition of nations led by BRICS.